All right, well, let's begin. I'd like to welcome everyone here to Conference on World Affairs, panel 3863, titled Moderate versus Radical Islam in the Middle East. It's Wednesday, April 8th, 4:30 here in the UMC Center Ballroom. I'm your moderator, Joel Parker. While I do the brief introductions of our panel, everyone please take out your cell phone or anything else that goes beep or Twitter or anything like that and turn it off. I will make brief introductions, but there are much longer bios in the program, and I really encourage you to read those to look at the very extensive experience and backgrounds of our panelists. So starting at my far right, your far left, is Willow Wilson. Willow is a novelist and writer. For the first comic book about a female Muslim hero, the most recent reboot of the Ms. Marvel series featuring Kamala Khan, a 16-year-old Pakistani American from New Jersey, which was just nominated for a Hugo Award. Willow has lived in Egypt from 2003 to 2008, working as a journalist and writing for articles and essays on Islam in the Middle East for publications including the Atlantic Monthly and the New York Times. She was a regular contributor for the now-defunct Egyptian opposition weekly Cairo magazine, and her memoir, The Butterfly Mosque, is the story of her conversion to Islam and life in Egypt. Next is Janet Breslin Smith. Janet has had a 14-year career working on the staffs of 3 U.S. senators, 14-year career as a professional of the national security strategy at the National War College, and in fact, is the first woman to be department chair of a graduate U.S. military institution. She lived 4 years in Riyadh, Saudi Arabia, with her ambassador husband, working with Saudi women, and I learned that she just became a grandmother for the 3rd time. Next is Malou Innocent, who is an adjunct scholar at the Cato Institute, foreign policy analyst at Cato from 2007 to 2013. And she's a member of the International Institute for Strategic Studies, and her primary research interests include the Middle East and Persian Gulf security issues and U.S. foreign policy toward Pakistan, Afghanistan, and China. And at the anchor position is Jim Smith, who has been attending the Conference on World Affairs since 2003, I believe. He's nominated as ambassador to Saudi Arabia starting in 2009 for 4 years. And yet he still attended the CWA during that tenure, showing he clearly has his priorities straight. So the format, I'm sure most of you are familiar with. We will start with the panelists, each giving about a 10-minute presentation. After that, there will be a chance for the panelists to add any comments or questions for each other, and then we will open up for questions to the audience. So I'd like to start, please, with Willow Wilson.
Hello. Is this on? Can you hear me? Okay, great. So as I was looking over my schedule for this year's conference and looking over the conversation topics, I'm always struck when I get these things and I say, oh, wow, I wouldn't have thought of that, and oh, what an interesting topic, and some of them are so off the wall. I've got one on Friday called Death After Life, and I thought, wow. But there's always one that I look at and I'm like, oh, this one is going to be the guaranteed laugh riot. And I looked and I saw moderate versus extremist Islam in the Middle East, and I was like, oh, there it is. That's the one. This is an interesting topic to me for several reasons. I primarily engage with the Muslim world now via fiction, via pop culture. I write comic books, I write novels, or as I call them, books without pictures. my novel Aleph the Unseen, which was about a young hacker in an unnamed Middle Eastern emirate who kind of goes on the run from the very shadowy state security agency and accidentally kickstarts a revolution, came out during the Arab Spring and was banned in Qatar. So my primary point of access now is through entertainment, which gives me an interesting look, since many of my readers and the people that I'm friends with and the people I know who are activists are quite young, sort of 15 to 25 in that age range. So I get the privilege of sort of a little glimpse of what's coming down the pipeline, both in the Middle East, although primarily also here in the United States. And when I saw this topic, I thought, oh gosh, there's so much more to talk about now than there was for the last couple of years when we've had similar panels. And unfortunately, in terms of what is floating to the top, a lot of it is bad. We were all talking earlier upstairs, and we'd all agreed that the arrival of ISIS on the scene in the Middle East has changed the entire conversation. When I talk about what is going on right now in terms of what we sort of describe here in these very poetic terms as the battle for the heart of Islam and stuff like that. And I think that's problematic, which I'll get to. But it reminds me of a story, sort of a metaphorical fable, if you will, that was told to me once about a farmer, and he's got this barnyard cat. And he had a friend over, and the friend hears this barnyard cat yowling and yowling and yowling, and he's like, what's going on? And they run over to see, and the cat has sat on a rusty nail in the barn. And the farmer said, oh, he sat on a rusty nail, that's why he's yowling. And the friend says, well, why doesn't he get up? And the farmer says, doesn't hurt enough yet. I think for a long time in the Middle East, it was easy enough to compartmentalize the rise of violent extremism to the point where it didn't hurt enough to get off the nail. It was happening in isolated places. There were not attacks on big cities. These were things that were happening for presumably specific political reasons, which, well, even if you didn't agree with the methodology, you could say, well, yeah, I mean, I don't want to be colonized or whatever it is that they're saying. So, I mean, they're bad, but, we sort of rationalize in our minds why this is happening. And then along came ISIS, and finally it hurt enough. The nail hurt enough. And now what I see, especially among the younger generations, but really among everybody, particularly in Egypt, where I still have a lot of friends and family and people that I'm regularly in contact with and where I go back and forth, that the entire conversation has been altered about terrorism, about the role of religion in public life, and about what the ideal world, or even a less than crappy world, would look like going forward. And it's very, very interesting. It used to be that you would see people doing bad things in the name of Islam, and in the Middle East, it was very easy to say, like, oh well, yeah, but they're just they're isolated, they're extreme, they're whatever, and that is still true. But what has happened with ISIS is that they have shown such a spotlight on the things that people had chosen to ignore because they were no longer a society-wide problem, like, for example, slavery, that people are suddenly stepping back and saying, maybe we are not as done with this conversation as we thought we were. I know that for most Muslims in most places, the level of education that they have with regard to religion is roughly analogous to the average level of familiarity that an American Christian would have with the Bible, which is not a lot. You have enough sort of memorized that you can do your 5 daily prayers, and you know sort of the basic broad strokes about when things happened and why, and who the major figures were in Islamic history, and it kind of ends there. And so for a lot of people for whom Islam was just a natural cultural expression of their own ethics, they were not even aware that there were verses or sets of jurisprudence from the Middle Ages or what have you that justified slavery to begin with, because they'd grown up in a society in which slavery was considered bad. Therefore, they thought slavery must be against Islam. And in fact, it is, in the sense that in the early part of the 20th century, there was near universal agreement among Sunni scholars that once slavery had been abolished in a country, it was haram or forbidden to bring it back. Because there's very, very clear rulings that go all the way back to the Prophet Muhammad that one of the best things you can do and one of the most necessary things to spread justice is to free slaves. Therefore, if you have freed all of the slaves, you cannot bring them back without committing a major sin. So this was agreed upon in the early part of the 20th century. The problem that is happening now is one that was summarized very succinctly, and if you want a much more erudite, somewhat academic elite speak version of this, you can look up this article that I'm about to tell you about. Professor Mohammed Fadl, who is a law professor at the University of Toronto, wrote in the Islamic Monthly a few months ago an article called Islamophobia, ISIS, and the End of Sunnism. So I read that and I thought, and I've butted heads with Professor Fadl in the past. In fact, he's sort of one of those guys where like, he's said, oh, just, call me Mohammed. Why do you keep calling me Professor Fadl? And I'm like, because I don't like you sometimes. And I don't want to pretend like we're buddies when I might, kind of chew you out on Facebook or Twitter for something. But, I'm his loyal opposition, let's put it that way. And so what he talked about, which I thought was very interesting and an excellent example of the nail hurting enough that people are finally getting up off it, was that Professor Fadl is very much a traditionalist Sunni in a lot of ways. But what he does in the article is say something that seems so obvious, and yet it had never really been articulated in that way before, certainly not in English. And that is, when it comes to what we call Sunni Islam, nobody is driving the bus. That the traditional institutions of Sunni Islam that dated back 1,400 years are now largely antiquated, demolished, or have become part of these autocratic state structures, and therefore they've become kind of toothless because they're considered parts of the state rather than freestanding religious entities. They're considered an arm of a regime rather than scholars who speak for all Muslims. And I sat there and I was like, that's what it is. They're really, institutionally speaking, there is not today such a thing as Sunni Islam. There are Sunnis, I'm one of them, but there are there is no caliphate, there's no universally accepted set of opinions to guide people who consider themselves Sunni. And that's why I'd always wondered, like, when you get into Shiite Islam, Shiites are the minority in the Muslim world. They make up between 15 and 20% of the global Muslim population, and they do not, in general, have a terrorism problem, which is not to say that they do not have some very extremist views in some places. Iran, of course, is being the most famous example. But they do not, in general, export terrorism, even though they are using the same books. And the reason why that is should be fairly clear, and yet it wasn't for a long time. They still have an intact authority structure. There is still a set of guys with whom the buck stops. There is no such thing in Sunni Islam. There's no Sunni pope. There isn't even a Sunni collegiate of people who can send down fatwas or edicts, which everybody takes seriously. And the whole reason that ISIS, one of the big reasons for being that ISIS, Boko Haram, Al-Qaeda, all of these guys have, is that they say the clergy has become corrupt. We can't follow the scholars anymore, either because the institutions have become weak or because they've been co-opted by these authoritarian states. They are no longer trustworthy. So we are in charge now. And even though there is this endless, literally endless cacophony of voices from what we would call moderate Sunni sheikhs going through point by point, debunking all of ISIS's theology, ISIS is now under no obligation to listen to them because they have no real authority. All they can do is sort of talk at the void and hope that people listen to them. And so there is real institutional chaos in the Sunni world, and there's no real one person or set of people to turn to kind of fix it. Everybody asks all the time whenever I do these panels, where are the moderate voices? Why aren't they speaking up? They're everywhere. Just a few months ago, a set of 100 of the top scholars in the world, here in the United States, in the Middle East, in Indonesia, in Malaysia, in North Africa, in South Africa, came together and drafted a 40-page refutation, point by point, of ISIS theology. They translated it into Arabic, into French, into English, and into German, and it was covered on exactly 0 Western media outlets.
How many?
What was that? I don't know. Not being in the Arab world, I don't know what it was covered on, if it was covered there. So there are a multitude of voices speaking out against these people. The problem is they have no real power. They're like camp counselors. They give guidelines, not actual rules. They don't have any actual authority about the people that they're talking to. And so you can have very intelligent people who are saying very intelligent things, and yet none of what they are saying and none of the changes that have been made in Gestalt Sunni Islamic law over the centuries has been given any kind of authority, like, for example, Vatican II. The equivalent of Vatican II in the Sunni world has been happening really since the 19th century. But the problem is that there is no one authority that says, okay, we've come to this set of conclusions, this is what's going to go from now on, and that's it. I like to make the example, like, what if we were to keep the Constitution of the United States, but eliminate the government? Who would be the strongest people around? Probably the right-wing militias out in places like Arizona, who think that they have the keys. They know exactly what the Constitution is saying. They can read the Second Amendment and say, it tells us right there we can have guns. Everybody can have guns. We can all have guns. Whereas I can read it and say, the third word in this thing is well regulated. What about that don't you understand? Regulation is right there in the actual amendment. So, when people say, like, well, how could it be that there's this kind of disagreement? It's one thing or it's the other thing. It should be clear. It's not. It's not even that clear with our own documents, our own, sort of foundation of our society. So that's what I kind of try to remind people of. Imagine that in the case of Sunni Islam, the government is gone. There's no president, there's no Congress, there's no nothing. All you have are the sort of vigilante groups who have a document and they think it gives them certain powers. So it's a huge mess. But the good thing is, I think the silver lining is that there's a generation coming up now that is very tech-savvy, very educated, very connected to youth movements around the world, and there's a lot of them. And they are really changing the discussion in some pretty spectacular ways, both about freedom of belief, freedom of expression. These are not just kids, these are people who have put their lives on the line in places like Tahrir Square to get out and fight for what they believe. It would be a mistake to consider them secular. They are less religious than their parents, but statistically not totally a-religious. So I think, I think there's a certain segment of people who are like, we're going to raid around for the secular revolution that's going to come in the Middle East, and you're going to be waiting an awfully long time. But I think there is a lot of hope in these young people who are coming up now and who are asking the tough questions, who are holding leaders to account in a way that previous generations, I think, have not. And some of the older generations, the sheikhs, the professors, the people in power are now responding because now finally it hurts enough. So I think if there's one silver lining to sort of the gruesome situation that we find ourselves in now, it's that we have hit bottom, that now finally the necessary discussions are happening. And so I think in the future, though I am not that optimistic for the short term, when I see the creativity and the plethora of voices that are coming up in a lot of these countries and the very sensible things that they are saying, I have great hope for the medium and long term to come. Thanks.
That was great. Can you hear me? Yes. That was great, and I think you're going to hear a theme about this, about debate and the discussion of these things within Islam. When I got this assignment, I thought to myself, I'm not from the Middle East, I'm not a Muslim, and I'm not an extremist. So
2 out of 3 is not bad.
Now, my kind husband down the road here has always teased me that my PhD is not really in political science, it is in the question why. Because I ask why over and over and over again. And when we went to Saudi Arabia, as he pointed out, I was in why heaven. I wanted to I was in a unique and honestly, it was a very, it was a privileged position. There are no tourist visas to Saudi Arabia. You do not see, Japanese or French delegations of people going around Riyadh looking at all the sites. You can come into Riyadh to the kingdom if you have a business visa, or if you have a family, or obviously if you're Muslim and you come for Hajj or Umrah, but there's not what we consider just open tourism walking around. And so I realized I was one of the very few Americans that would have an opportunity to live there for 4 years. So we made a commitment that we would stay as long as President Obama and the King would let us stay there. And so what I want to share with you, and I feel very modest about this, honestly, are at least my observations of how the kingdom, people in the kingdom that I came to know and really feel close to and love, how they presented their faith to me and what it felt like to be there. And I actually wrote this out because this is a complicated issue. Honestly, I need the 1 minute reminder on this because this is such a hard issue and it's so complicated to understand. And I'm still in the process of trying to even get a little inch down the road of understanding. So I want to share with you my own, how I make sense of this. And 2 things I want to try to convey first is that I found myself whenever I was in the kingdom or even in this country talking to Saudi friends who are really devoutly and love their religion, especially when I was in the kingdom itself, I always felt as the discussion began that a wire mesh was coming over me in a constrictive way, and it was coming down pretty dark and hard around me. And I was entering a tunnel, and I was forcing my brain to go in the tunnel with that person, and I was then engaged in a debate that would restructure how I tried to understand something, but I always felt constraint around me. We live in a very open society that's almost like this, and when I was there, I felt very much constrained. The other thing is, we have a nephew who is a scholar of divinity, a professor of divinity, he's a Catholic, and whenever I do talk to him, I have some similar feeling that he wants to make reference, and it's his profession, to make reference to the written word, to the documents, to the structure of the theology, the richness of the Catholic tradition. And when I would talk to Saudis, the same thing, making deep and intricate relationships and references to things in the Quran and the Hadith and the other writings related to the religion. I don't come from a tradition like that, and so again, I felt myself needing to be more disciplined about making sure and certainly understanding that my Saudi friends felt they needed to footnote every thought they had to make reference to something in the Quran, especially in the Quran. Now, to begin this discussion, the way I can hopefully make you have a feel for the tension between what we think of as modern and extreme, or the tensions Willow's talking about, I also will go to the modern media, even for a grandmother. I remember about a year or 2 ago, right before ISIS started, the popular video and the song Happy came out. We sang it last night if you were in Mackey with us. And after that came out, I remember, or somebody told me about this. Actually, a Saudi friend of mine said, go YouTube, see British Muslims happy. And I urge you all to go home tonight and Google happy British Muslims. And you're going to see this really cute video of little kids dancing or older kids dancing, men and women. These are Muslim kids I think they're in London, and everyone's smiling and singing this song. And this whole phenomena went around the world. So you had happy videos in Indonesia and Paris and stuff. And I kept to see, would there be a video in Saudi Arabia? There was one in Bahrain, and there was one I think in Yemen even, and all over. And there are a few. If you Google it today, I did it today to see where some new ones coming up. And there's one, and there's a comment in the little comments you can make is, where are the women? Because it's a bunch of guys, and they're not in thobes either, so which is a traditional male dress, the white robes. At the time these videos came out, and it is impossible to watch them without smiling, because there are kids and little kids and old people dancing to that song. Around the same time as when ISIS started, and other videos began to appear. Beheadings, burning somebody in a cage. And so that kind of, I think, conveys to you something that Willow is also touching in her social media, this pull. And so many Westerners will talk about they are looking for moderate moderate Muslims. And sometimes I feel that when they talk about it, they only mean Muslims who embrace Western values. And honestly, for some Muslims I've met, that sometimes means they like to drink a glass of wine. They've identified in their mind what that means Western. But as we lived in the kingdom, I tried to develop a deeper sense of what was going on, what I was watching. And I came to the feeling that I was not really interested in meeting moderates. I wanted to meet conservatives. And at the time, as my husband knows very well, I was actually hoping to be arrested by the religious police. Because I wanted to talk to them. And in a gender-segregated society, they were not going to have me over for dinner, and so I felt if I did something and could be arrested, I would at least be brought into headquarters, and I would have a chance. Don't look at me.
Well,
I would have a chance to talk to them.
tell them the whole story.
So the whole story is, Jim actually was not worried about an international incident. He was worried that what would happen, because indeed my PhD is in why, that after 4 or 5 hours of having me ask them questions over and over again, they would actually pay the ransom to him to take me back.
Well, she had a sign, and she was going to stand out in front of the diplomatic quarter where all the police are and the harassment goes on, and just stand there by herself with a sign that said, respect,
Dignity.
hoping to get arrested.
Yeah. So they resisted this attempt. I did too. But anyway, but in a more serious thing, I honestly, I tried in the first 3 years we were there especially not to talk very much actually, and try to listen. And how are people expressing themselves, and how was their faith expressed? How did they not just relate to their government, but how did they relate to their faith? And what I'm trying to get an appreciation of this. I've lived in Asia. I grew up in a Japanese American community. We had a Buddhist temple in our town in California. We lived in Latin America. I've been in other cultures, but no other culture confounded me as much as my experience of living in Saudi Arabia. And I want to say in the beginning, I'm not going to be making, and I hope you understand, I'm not making a blanket statement now here about Muslims themselves or even about all Saudis. I'm trying to share at least my one woman's observation about what I felt. And I felt as ISIS began and as other, Boko Haram, other groups like that, and we were having a constant parade, and also I have to say as Assad in Syria, the TV there is covered with much violence in covering all these issues. And Saudi friends of mine would come up to me and say, Janet, you need to understand this is not Islam, what you're seeing. And I began to wonder, well, then how is it different? How do you think of this as different? What is similar, what is different? And I have to say that of all the Saudis I know, with maybe 1 or 2 exceptions, they hold their faith dear to them. There's a tenderness about it to me, that if you get in too deep a conversation, there is almost this panic feeling of, I don't want to get into an area that might go too far away into critical analysis because that would be very dangerous. And so there's always, again, this idea of constraint on what you say. There was almost a fear that it was hard for me to tap it exactly, but they wanted the conversation to go this far, but not too much further. But as you know, I kept asking why and trying to understand. And so here's how I kind of, again, in my own mind, and to those of you who are Muslims out in the audience, and also to those of you who follow this more scholarly, in a scholarly way than I'm open to being educated some more. But here's how I've come to feel about it. At one core level, you know that there are 5 tenets in Islam, and certainly the people in ISIS, I would imagine, feel they hold these just as deeply as any Saudi living in the kingdom. That there is an acknowledgement, a statement of faith that there's one God and Muhammad is his prophet. So it's a monotheistic religion. That you have responsibility to pray 5 times a day. That you have a responsibility to give zakat, a concept of sharing your own wealth for those in need. that you observe the fast and also self-control during the holy month of Ramadan, and that if you are capable, you make a pilgrimage to Mecca. So I think those ideas, I think you would agree, are shared by extremists as well as what we would call moderate. For many, and especially in Saudi Arabia, I always felt that they very much felt a literal interpretation of the Quran. There was not a sense of interpretation, but again, people would footnote what they felt by a reference to a specific phrase or chapter of the Quran, and the hadiths and other statements of people who observed the Prophet and what he did in his lifetime. I also feel this is a shared concept, both in, if you want to call it extreme or moderate, in that there's a shared sense that Islam is under attack. Obviously, from the ISIS point of view, you need to defend it with your fist. I think in the Saudi view, it's that we need to be a country that expresses it in their belief, in their actions every day, and in their development as a nation. Saudis would say, and I've seen them interviewed about this issue, that one difference between ISIS and the kingdom is that they have they follow Sharia, but there's a structured court system, and it's not an arbitrary system of just one man here who self-proclaims himself the Khalifa, that there is a structure. But obviously you know, and you've seen articles in the paper, that the punishment structures are pretty similar. Beheading and stoning and et cetera. But it is true, Saudi Arabia is a nation state, and ISIS is, and Saudis would say, a group of thugs, basically, and who do not do Islam service. I then tried to think more deeply about them, but what would be attracting Saudi kids to ISIS? So Iraq is on the border of Saudi Arabia. If you look at a map of Saudi Arabia, the northern border is Iraq, and then beyond that, Syria. Many families have relatives back and forth. This is not some faraway place. And here's what I've come up with, and I'll have I don't have where my page to go. I'll share this and we'll come back. And again, I'm open to criticism from people who are Muslim and who are from the Middle East, but this is my observation, me. I began to feel that in talking to young mothers who had little children, that there's something we need to understand, at least in my observation about this, that in the Saudi school system and the way religion is presented, there is a very, very strong and powerful and horrible description of torture that a child receives when they're very young, kindergarten, first and second grade. This is not unknown to us. Those of us who might have been raised Catholic in the 50s also had a very, very strong description of all these things as a definition of hell. And this is true in both religions that have a strong sense of the day of judgment. That idea of the day of judgment and punishment is a factor I think I need to have a better appreciation of, to understand that the depth of that you receive as a young child, and how that then influences your sense of things. Clearly a focus on practice. Are you covered correctly? Are you praying correctly? Are you washing your hands correctly? It's very much a focus on practice. And then there's this sense about that Islam is under attack. I always had this sense, despite the fact we see it as this muscular threat, there's actually a sense of that it's very fragile. And that if a woman drives, or if there is debate, or if something happens, that the whole religion will fall apart. And I never understood this, because to me, the Saudi families I met were strong families. Their children were raised very respectfully. I did not feel the fragility, or the weakness, let's say. But they acted, to me, as if it was so, again, fragile, that any critical analysis would break it apart. And so therefore, it resulted in a fear that if there was a discussion or a criticism, or this, even having the scholars come together and agree, that the very process of debate that would lead to a fatwa or agreement would be dangerous. So I know my time is out. Let me just make one last comment about this, because I do think it is the beginning of a moment in history where the possibility of this debate and discussion is beginning. The other thing I noticed in the rhythm of consideration is that in the years we were there, something would happen. A woman would try to drive, or someone would say we need sports, or something would happen. And in the next day or two, a cleric or some group would say, that's haram, it's wrong, bad, bad, bad. And the discussion would end. Months would go by, sometimes years would go by, and then another person would start the issue again. And I had this strange sense of rhythm where a discussion would briefly start and then stop. And so you never developed what I think you're touching on something. You never developed the beginning of conversation. And to me, that's what this is about. You're being faced with something. These are your children. This is how they're acting. You need to discuss among yourselves. This is a question within the family of Islam. This is not about me at all. I wish them well. It has nothing to do with me. These are deep and profound questions to me of what you want Islam to be and how you want to achieve that. So to me, the question is, what are the values in Islam? Not the practice necessarily. What are the values in Islam that mean something to you as a Muslim, and how do you want to see them expressed in society? Thanks.
Wow, that was fantastic. To my two previous co-panelists, amazing discussion. I mean, this is really fantastic. I'm happy to be on this panel, and I thank you all for coming out. This is obviously a very pertinent topic and one that resonates with a lot of people, and it's on the top of everyone's minds. I too will rely on some notes because I do believe as well that it's a very complicated and complex issue, and it's one that, events are changing so dramatically and so radically that it's difficult to sort of stay ahead of the curve. But what I want to do, I want to speak less from a personal perspective and more from sort of a wonky, policy-oriented perspective, in the sense that I want to get you to start thinking about radical and moderate in a different way, in the sense of not as the Muslim populace being radical, but really many of the regimes and some of the regimes that the United States has supported politically and militarily and economically being the radical regimes, and it's the people, many of the people, the pluralities and the majorities in the Muslim world, who are the moderates, who are suppressed by the radical regimes that we assist. And we've seen this during the Cold War and during the current war on terror, where the regimes, especially in Pakistan and Saudi Arabia, that I'll speak to. Pakistan's obviously not in the Middle East, it's in South Asia, but if we just broaden out the Middle East a little more, then we can include it there. But you see with these two regimes that there are very radical abuses against individual rights and civil rights, abuses against the people, and really you see the use of religion for purely political objectives and not necessarily for religious objectives. How many of you are familiar with a book written by General S.K. Malik called The Quranic Concept of War? No one. It's a very esoteric book, but it's one that has a deep level of significance, at least within Pakistan. This was because it was published in Lahore in 1979, and this Quranic Concept of War was this idea that the center of gravity in jihad was the enemy or the non-believer's heart, that you would go after and attack everything that the enemy holds dear. And just to quote one line from his book, you can get the PDF online, it's, quote, "Terror is not a means of imposing decision on the enemy. It is the decision we wish to impose upon him," unquote. This idea of constant jihad, of the idea of always constantly waging war against non-Muslims. This was an idea, number one, that had state sanction from the Pakistani military, because back in the 1980s, General Zia al-Haq, who was the president, a military dictator, army chief of staff, he wrote the foreword for that book. And that book became mandatory reading for the Pakistani army. It was critical significance for Pakistan army in its relationship with Afghanistan and with India. And we see that now in how it's proliferated throughout the region. This is, again, a country that received untold tens of billions of dollars in assistance, waging jihad against the Soviets in Afghanistan, and now in the war on terror and counterterrorism campaigns. And even, when you see the presidency of General Pervez Musharraf, that was ostensibly a secular leader, who suppressed and liberal dissent against his regime. And it wasn't a religious sense. This was a secular regime that did so objectively for political purposes. It was not for religious purposes. In the current regime now of Nawaz Sharif, what we see as well, and the subsequent civilian leaders, just recently, in fact, the Pakistani government stamped out and banned WordPress. This is a blogging platform. This is amongst a host of various other social media platforms, such as YouTube, that have also been banned by the Pakistani government. Again, not for religious reasons, but for a reason of suppressing internal dissent against its regime. So I think oftentimes in the West, we conflate the two. We conflate it that, that these social media platforms or media is being banned for religious reasons. Oftentimes it's not. Oftentimes it's for secular political purposes. I want to turn just briefly to the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia, another country that's received a great deal of U.S. military, economic, and political largesse from the beginning of the Cold War up until the present day. And here you see why the United States has supported the Saudis, because of its possession of vast quantities of oil. Of course, during the Cold War, it was a staunch opponent of Soviet communism. We were in this U.S.-Saudi Cold War alliance against these godless Soviets. But at the same time, during that same time, we saw the Saudis exporting a very virulent, and it's a subset of Islam, a very unique interpretation of Islam known as Wahhabism in the West, and sort of a perversion of it known as Salafism amongst its adherents. And this was an ideology that was exported throughout the Muslim world, and one that wasn't necessarily had great resonance amongst many Muslims, but it eventually had a great deal of popularity and significance over time because of its propagation by the Saudi regime. And here you see especially, again, this is a regime that certainly it's religious, but some of its own policies aren't necessarily religious, like the banning of free speech, the banning of competitive elections, the banning of political parties. This is because for its own reasons, for its political objectives, it wants to maintain a grip on power. And that's not a religious objective, that's just a purely political objective, and we must be careful not to conflate the two. And of course, what we see now with the resultant Arab Spring and the rise of ISIS as well, you see a proliferation of Salafist, ideologically bent groups. You saw them on the rise across North Africa and the Middle East. They had Saudi support in Iraq, Lebanon, and Syria. They formed factions and political parties in Bahrain, Kuwait, Algeria, Libya, and Yemen. And they won pluralities and majorities in post-revolutionary elections in Tunisia, in Morocco, and in Egypt. So you see from Beirut to Baghdad, a US-sponsored allied regime was assisting and propagating this radical interpretation of Islam, and really against the very moderates that we would seek, or we'd hope to seek, see rise in this region. And just recently, this is something that was sort of spoken about earlier about the rise of moderates and these moderate citizens. The Saudi regime regularly imprisons moderate Islamists, regularly. This is a radical regime that imprisons the moderates. And we saw this recently with Raif Badawi. He's a Saudi blogger. In 2008, he came out with the blog Free Saudi Liberals, about the rise of the Saudi religious police and their interactions with local Saudis. And just last year, he was imprisoned. He was charged with 10 years in prison, 1,000 lashes. And again, this is a regime that publicly beheads apostates, drug traffickers, homosexuals. But we only look at ISIS. We don't look at the regime that we support and that we sponsor. Now, the Saudi regime, they stopped at several hundred lashes against Badawi, not because of the goodness of their heart, but because he was so weakened by the beatings and so injured by them. So just to, again, just give you that perspective, I want to get you thinking differently about the notion of radical and moderate. And oftentimes, the regimes that we support use religion in service to the state. And it's important that we make that distinction. I think I'm just going to finish on this, and then I'll turn it over to Jim, but this is something that was also touched on earlier about how a lot of Westerners bemoan the fact that, why aren't moderates standing up against ISIS or standing up against Al-Qaeda and decrying these people? Those same people in the West who condemn moderates in the Muslim world for not speaking out, they ignore the plethora of bloggers, of feminists, of rap artists, of reformers across the Muslim world who are seeking a voice and who do want to speak out. And it's sad that instead of supporting them, we're supporting the radicals that oppress them. Thank you.
Well, I'm batting cleanup, but we're ahead 10-0, so I'm not sure my at-bat matters. One of the things that I came to understand is that Americans are not comfortable talking about religion. It's private decision, is a private conversation. And for most of us, whatever you believe in is your business and not mine, and I don't care. And you go back, it's part of our foundation as a country. That's not true in the Islamic world. In Saudi Arabia, as Janet said, Islam is life and controls every aspect of your life. And they're very comfortable about talking religion. So you actually learn to talk about it freely. And of course, the conversation generally starts out with, have you thought about converting to Islam? And the answer is always, inshallah. But there's some fascinating dynamics. I was quoted in the Boston Globe last summer, just before a trip to Riyadh, Saudi Arabia. I was quoted as saying, the religious leadership in Saudi Arabia is content to issue fatwas on the color of women's fingernail polish, but on the death of thousands, tens of thousands of fellow Muslims, they're silent. And then I went to Saudi, and a very dear friend, he said, hey, I saw you quoted in the Boston Globe. And I said, okay, well, what did you think? He goes, well, it's about time somebody said it. I think there's a lot going on here beyond the religion. And if you look at Islam, I think you've got to separate political dimension, cultural, religious, because there are different parts of that, even though Muslims will tell you Islam is life, and that's the way they see it. I do agree that, well, let me take a step back. In watching the crowds in Tahrir Square in January of 2011, I was truly stunned when I looked at the crowds, because there were no American flags being burned. There were no British flags being burned. There have been a lot of British flags burned in Egypt over the decades. There were no Israeli flags being burned. And I couldn't quite figure out what was going on. And in fact, even though we had watched this build over a couple of years, including Saudi Arabia with the Jeddah floods, there was a dynamic going on that was different. And what I realized that in Tahrir Square, for the first time in 700 years, it was no longer about somebody else. It was a coming to terms with their own issues. It was about them, finally. Because you go back 700 years, and in Baghdad in the 13th century was the House of Wisdom. It was called the Bayat al-Hikmah. It was a center of knowledge in the world, be it medicine, astronomy, all of the Greek classics had been translated, and then in 1248 the Mongols came in and leveled it all, and the Tigris ran black with the color of ink. So the Mongols were there about 300 years, the Ottomans roll in, and they were there about 300 years. And at the end of World War II, you got the British and the French drawing lines that we're living with today. At the end of World War II, you got the Russians on one side, the Americans on the other side, pick one. When the Berlin Wall came down, and America was left standing. And I never quite understood why in the 20 years I'd go in and out of the region on different capacities, every conversation always ended up about U.S. foreign policy, because it had always been about somebody else until January 2011. And much of what's going on in this debate of moderate versus radical Islam is a debate that's going on, and it's driven by this and the ubiquitousness of information that I don't think is going to subside. And if anything, Daesh is very competent at using social media to get their message out to attract people that come to the fight. But the ubiquitous of information is fundamentally changing the opportunity of people in the region to debate. The problem, as I believe correctly pointed out, over time, autocratic regimes have leveraged religion for control. And arguably, you can say, it was a lot easier when people did what they're told. Well, they're not doing that anymore. And not only are they controlling people, they're controlling the ulama, the religious leadership. And if you look at Saudi Arabia as an example, it is Salafism. It's quite as Salafism. I would disagree a little bit on some of the characterization of its export. But nonetheless, the Wahhabism, if you will, is that political contract between the religious community and the leadership, which is a mutually supportive relationship where the religious community gets its support from the government, and the government leverages the religious community to support their, keep them in power. So you have the religious community dealing with the laws of God, and the Al Saud regime in Saudi Arabia dealing with the laws of man, and the two don't cross. So on any political issue, they're dead silent. Dead silent. And then when there is a political unrest, then they come to the defense of the regime. And again, this is a control mechanism over time. And then you've got an institutional governor against open debate that goes back to this idea of the door to ijtihad is closed. Independent thinking was really put at a halt as Islam spread, and all these different ideas about what it should be. They essentially closed the door to independent thinking, saying that there has got to be a reference in the Quran and the Hadith to justify how you would solve a modern day problem. And I would argue that's why Islam is the most cited religion in the world, because you got to have a reference today on why you would do something. This stifles independent thought and action, because the default is you've got to have a religious scholar as the basis. Now, a lot of that dynamic is changing, but it's being driven by political leadership in the region. King Abdullah of Saudi Arabia, during Ramadan in 2012, called the heads of all Muslim majority countries together. I gave them a month's notice, and 42 out of 43 showed up. It shows the influence that he had. And the focus of the conversation was, why are Muslims killing Muslims? And it was what was going on in Syria, in essentially the early days of Syria. He's tried to set up a religious dialogue center. All of this trying to create some debate, but in a controlled fashion. We've seen recently two very positive evolutions, and that is President al-Sisi in Egypt and King Abdullah in Jordan, as political leaders, are saying we have got to address Islam and what is going on inside of Islam. So I quite agree that if you look at the political challenges within the Arab Islamic world, by and large, it has been a challenge against existing authorities and governance. Where there hasn't been a challenge, you've actually seen reasonable to good governance, where the people of a country are comfortable that their government is looking after their needs and interests. Where you get a break from that, then you've got a real challenge. And then I find that there are very creative people that are working their way around these things. And one of my favorite groups in Saudi Arabia was an entity called the Khadija Center. It was a women's business adjunct to the business community in Jeddah, Saudi Arabia. And their contention is, we agree with the concept of going back to the days of the Prophet Muhammad, peace be upon him. And in those days, let's see, his only wife was Khadijah. His first wife was his only wife as long as she lived. She was his boss. She hired him. She was senior to him. And for their entire lives, she was his only wife. And they were partners in religion and partners in business. That's what we want to go back to. Thank you.
So before we open up for questions from the audience, I would just like to ask if anyone on the panel has anything additional they want to say or any questions they want to ask of each other.
I do. I want to take on something you said, because it's one of the things also I struggle with on the issue of human rights and pressure and all of that whole. When I lived in Chile, I was involved in Amnesty International after the Pinochet dictatorship started. And so that was the beginning of my professional career was really a deep concern about human rights. And my model was you have an authoritarian ruler at the top and you have a population striving to be free and to be liberated. And so US foreign policy or European foreign policy should be to put pressure on the guy at the top. And if you did, this would come up. And that made sense in a Latin American context. When I got to Saudi Arabia, challenged my assumptions about that. And there's a woman named Karen Elliott House who wrote a book about Saudi Arabia. She covered it for 25 years with the Wall Street Journal. And she says in the beginning of her book, there's some problems with her book, but in the beginning of the book, she says in her 25 years of covering Saudi Arabia and interviewing people all throughout that period, she never once found a yearning for democracy. On the other hand, she did find a yearning for justice, and that to me goes back into what Willow's talking about. But the idea in my traditional model of human rights, I'm not saying what you said is wrong, it's just that it's the population as a whole in expressing its culture and its history over all of its experience is a conservative culture. It is not yearning necessarily to be Western. In fact, as you've heard from other panels, Western values are considered to be decadent, horrible. We're drug people, we drink too much, we don't wear enough clothes, all those problems. And so, to me, it isn't that it's wrong, it's just that it's different. And I go back to my argument that as that culture addresses what does it want to be, and even as I say that, I know I'm expressing an American view of this, because I'm assuming that Muslims will debate what do we want Islam to be. And that is different than an authority structure where a clerical group at the top will issue a fatwa and tell you what it's going to be. So even then, I'm having a hard time moving over into that view. But nonetheless, I agree that with this, though, even Islam is going to have to confront participation. Don't you think at a broader level? Oh, yeah. And so the role of the United States, I don't think, obviously Saudi Arabia receives no foreign aid from us, it's a wealthy nation. But in terms of support, yes, there are the power relationships you're talking about. But it can't blind us to the fact that the culture itself is deeply, deeply conservative and very judgmental of itself. I found Saudis are very hard on each other. And so if someone says something, it reminds, I hope none of you are from Iowa, but it reminds me of a small town in Iowa where if someone, Mrs. Smith kind of wears a little flashy dress and everyone comments about that, you become very aware of conforming. And that's one of the feelings I had there, that there was a lot, they were hard on each other.
I don't know, though, that it... Oh, go ahead, please.
Okay, well, just because I was pointed at repeatedly, so. So I think this sort of signifies the problem that we have is that we don't listen to Muslims. We don't listen to the Muslim populace. We don't listen to people on the ground. If you've looked since, not you, the universal you, not you. If you look at the polling data from, Pew Global Research Center, from World Public Opinion Survey, dozens upon dozens, volumes of survey data, focus groups, reviews and research and interviews interviews with people in the Muslim world, you do find that majorities and pluralities do aspire to democracy. However, democracy on their terms. And this is something that I neglected to mention. And this is really important because the idea of aspiring to democracy, and democracy in the very, just the basic sense of, the will of the people should be the basis of governance. But at the same time, you find that there's a contradiction there because they also believe that Sharia should be the basis of governance. So there's a tension there. There's a conflict. And so I think, when we say, oh, they aspire to democracy, I'm certainly not saying that they aspire to liberal Western democracy, not at all. But they do like the idea of multi-party systems. They do like the idea of freedom of expression. They do like the idea of freedom of the press. But at the same time, as much as they do like those things, and freedom of the press and freedom of expression, there's a but to that. Well, can you criticize the prophet? Can you do these things? So, there is a conflict there. And these are things that, Muslims and Islam will have to wrestle with. And I think what becomes very problematic is that as they're trying to wrestle with these contradictions and these dilemmas, is that they feel it's hindering them when they feel that the United States or the West is breathing down their neck, telling them what to do.
I thought it was interesting what you were saying about the sense of everybody watching everybody else, that there being the sense that to be Western is to be decadent. And in fact, that is, it strikes me that
At least
in Saudi, but you see echoes of that certainly in other parts of North Africa and the Middle East, less so when you go further east. But what is ironic to me is that is a very recent set of accusations leveled against the West. If you go back to what is considered by both Muslims and non-Muslims as sort of the golden age of Islam, the criticisms were reversed. You look at the letters of, I think it was Innocent II, the Pope who kicked off the Second Crusade, and one of his big criticisms of the Muslim world and why we need to go rescue Jerusalem from these maniacs was that they were decadent, that they sheltered homosexuals, that they talk openly about sex, and in fact, there's a lot of sex manuals from that era written in Arabic and in Persian that would, even today are a little bit hair curling, but it clearly historically need not be that way. I think Muslims, like everybody else, have a very short historical memory, and it's even shorter when it comes to themselves. We tend to sort of go back to whatever point in history we decide that we were, like the best, that we were kind of on the top of our game. We don't like to go back further than that because things get a little bit morally muddy. And I think the same is true in the Muslim world. So I think one has to sort of remember that not everything that all Muslims do is because of the Quran. I feel that somebody, I think it was a Muslim stand-up comic, said that there's this truism, that exists now here because of what's going on, that if a regular, Joe Schmo white guy runs a red light, it's because he's a jerk. If a Muslim dude does it, it's because of the Quran. And we have to remember that these are people who have psychology, emotions, social structures, historical memory, and that all of those things are coming into play as well in what we and they refer to as quote-unquote Islam.
But just one last comment about whenever you live in a foreign country, it makes you reflect on yourself, right? Because you're not aware of how you think strangely until you see somebody else thinking in a different way. And every day I'm confronted with the fact of I'm making an assumption about how a Saudi would act, but I'm basing it on me. And as an example of that, lots of times when we were there, and we would be talking about any topic, let's say driving, and Saudi friends would say, "Oh, Janet, you need to understand, this is just our culture. This is not Islam." Obviously, the early prophets' wives and other people at the time rode camels and did things. So people would say, "This is our culture." And I, as an American, would say to them, "But you are the culture. The culture's not something over there someplace. You are the culture." But in saying that, I'm expressing this idea of participation. They were expressing a familiar feeling of authority above you, which constrains what you do. And again, I have two questions in my mind about the future. One is the impact of this, because it can go both ways. But the other thing is, that the King Abdullah invested this immense amount of money on education. 25% of the budget in Saudi Arabia is devoted to education. And the scholarships that are available to young boys and girls, high school students, on the basis of merit, not based on connections and not based on gender, have been taken advantage of by Saudi young women and men. And there are, 100,000 Saudi students in the United States right now, and in China, and in Japan, and in Europe. Well, this embrace of education, even if it's mainly in STEM, and it is, mainly in engineering and math and science, nonetheless, that is a factor that I think will embrace in the general Islamic community. But the real question to me is there a mechanism, and I think this is what she's talking about, how can there be a mechanism for Muslims to come together, either at the lower level or the higher level, to really chew on these issues with knowledge, with exposure to the world, and again to say, what are our own solutions to these problems? I think it's a time for a new political theory to arise. It might be some combination, given tribal structures, of a combination of selection in tribes, councils, and election. It might be a new form of political theory that we cannot imagine. We have our own. I like ours, it's for us. It's possible, if I'm optimistic about this in the face of all of this bloodshed, that germs of this conversation could start.
All right, I would like to open this up to questions from the audience. And usual guidelines, we have microphones on either side, so you can line up by the microphones. Please give priority to students for questions, and please make it a question.
Any Saudians in the audience? Yeah. Saudis, come on down.
Hey.
Ooh, come on down. Talk to me. Talk to me.
Well, go ahead and start here.
Hello, am I audible? Hi. Thank you all. I really enjoyed listening to you speak, and I wanted to ask, so I don't want to downplay the role that the West plays in a lot of conflicts, and I don't want to point fingers, but I did have some questions about the text, and particularly the Hadith. I know I've read some I haven't read most of the Hadith, but there are some passages that I read that I thought were a little troubling, and there was one in particular. It says, "The day of judgment will not come about until Muslims fight the Jews, when the Jew will hide behind stones and trees. The stones and trees will say, 'O Muslims, O Abdullah, there is a Jew behind me. Come and kill him.'" And so I wanted to ask you. I know Willow Wilson, you mentioned that a lot of folks don't necessarily read, the whole text or take it all to heart. Just like here in the West, we don't necessarily read every word of the Bible per se, and there's definitely problematic passages in, say, the Old Testament. But I'd like your comment, anyone on the panel, about the role of the text and how that has an effect, and also, in particular, is the Hadith viewed as equally as divine as the Quran?
You want me to jump on it?
It has to be you.
So one of the problems that we're facing now, and ISIS's example is of this, is that because no one is driving the bus, a lot of the 1,400 years of discussion about these issues has been thrown out. So when in fact you take these little verses in isolation, this seems like, oh my God, this is giving Muslims license to kill Jews. But when in fact you take it in the context in which it was discussed, this was considered something horrible. Like, things will go so wrong that this will be the result. That this was the result of a conflict that was not a positive thing. The end of the world is not like a happy thing where, like, yay, Muslims are going to rule and everything. It's part of what that is talking about is the degradation of knowledge, that Muslims will become like the sands of the beach, and yet the knowledge will have gone. That's part of that whole revelation about the, that's the Hadith. It's not really a revelation, but about the end of times. So part of the problem is you've got yahoos like ISIS who take one little bit of that and denude it of context, both in terms of the rest of the text and the historical discussion, and say, okay, from this I'm going to assume that it's okay for me to kill Jews. When in fact, if you look back at the historical discussion, it's the opposite. It's things will get so bad that the people of the book will kill each other wherever they may be, even if they're in hiding, even if they're civilians, da-da-da-da-da-da-da. And the tragedy is that people like you and people like us in the West, we look at ISIS and we say, well, okay, they must be right. We say, okay, that must, if they say that that's what it is, then that must be what it is. And we sort of do their excerpted reading of the entire tradition and take it at face value. I mean, that's the great tragedy, is that not only is there this core of very violent people who have said, like, okay, our interpretation, our little, like, we're going to excerpt this part and cobble it together into whatever, is the truth, but they've managed to convince the entire world, and everybody takes them at face value. So that to me is the real tragedy, is that the influence of this is, it's not just the extremist Muslims who are carrying water for this kind of warped philosophy, it's ordinary people who say, yes, Osama bin Laden is right. He's right because, that's what I see. So, I mean, it's unfair to ask ordinary civilians to go out and read these very massive and sometimes like head-bendingly arcane books about jurisprudence and about, all of these issues, but we should just keep in mind that we are not the first people. We act as though we are the first people to discover these texts. Like we are the very first people to ever have read the Quran or the Hadith or whatever. And this tradition's been around for 1,400 years. So my husband, who is one of the most well-educated people I know in terms of Islamic jurisprudence, once taught me, when I came to him with a similar question shortly after I converted when I was younger, and I was like, oh my God, what do I do? I can't, this is ridiculous, I can't, And he said, I'm going to introduce you to something called the bullshit rule. If it sounds like bullshit, it probably is.
All right, this is kind of pressure because everyone told me to get up here, but I'm from Saudi Arabia, and this is actually the third panel that I see Mr. Jim Smith on. But I see a lot of points that really make sense, and it's been a long time since Saudi Arabia has been using the Sharia law as the law of the whole country. So it's really developed into culture instead of becoming just a law. You can't really say that now you're going to change into a democracy, or you're still going to be a monarchy, but you're not going to follow Islamic law. It's really tough because all the youth, all of the people who grew up this way aren't willing to change. They want to keep it this way, and the people who follow Islam by the letter, or those who don't, as many of them are seen in Saudi Arabia, they don't want to change their lifestyle, they just want to keep it that way. So my question is it too late to change that lifestyle?
What do you think?
I think it's way too late.
But what do you mean by that? I mean, I guess my question is, as you say this, are you saying you want to see change, or you're happy with how things are?
Personally, I think my own opinion doesn't count for the whole country, because I'm from a minority of Saudi Arabia, the Shias. So we've been oppressed, we've been fought against, we've been shot at, we've been protesting. A lot of things that we've been doing hasn't been working in that area, in the East Coast, in the West Coast, in Riyadh, and everywhere. Our voice hasn't been heard. So it's really tough to say today we're going to be heard when we've been protesting and killed. And even a couple of days ago, maybe yesterday, there were raids in the east coast of Saudi Arabia. So it's really that we, as Shia, really want to get out there and start working in higher levels, but because of our place in society or in that culture, we can't really do anything in that area.
Jim will probably say something much more profound than me, but to me, the points you're raising, aside from just Shia Sunni, but this has to do with Christian, Jew, atheist, any groups. One of the most basic issues that confront mankind, and that I want you to think about as a student, is how do groups of different thought, whatever that different thought is, live together when they're in proximity to each other? In other words, us versus them. And there's one alternative is you just do war, and one side wins, one side loses, and you submit, okay? But in this era that you're in, the challenge for your generation is to think through, in the broad general sense, obviously within the context of Islam and your culture, how can groups get along with each other without threatening, to find some accommodation? And that, to me, at a theoretical level, is what political philosophy, and I hope you take some classes in political philosophy or theory, should help you think through. Jim can talk more about it. The harder issue.
You notice how she put you up to asking the question and then put me up to answering it. Are you from Qatif or?
Yes.
Okay. The Shia issue in Saudi Arabia is very complicated, at least for an outsider. You have kind of three different nodes of it. Qatif al-Umayyah, which has been a problem area, Al-Hassa, which is kind of balanced, and the leadership in city government is balanced, and everything kind of works until an ISIS-inspired attack during Ashura kills a bunch of people. And then you've got the Abu Saq tribe in Najran, which are the good Shia because they pledged allegiance to Abdulaziz back in 1934, and nobody talks about them. I think one of the biggest challenges is a political, not religious issue, that Saudi Arabia, the government tends to default with blaming someone else for a problem. And in the case of the uprisings in Qatif and Al-Umayyah, blame Iran. And there are some legitimate issues in and around Al-Umayyah and Qatif on development, which is driven by Aramco owning all the land around you. But you don't need to drill straight down anymore, so there's no legitimate argument for that. On the other hand, the Shia community in the eastern province have a higher employment rate than the rest of Saudi Arabia because of Aramco and the opportunity there. But there is this mindset that if there's a problem, it's because of Iran, and we need to crack down on the Shia. I had hoped that, and I'm still watching, but the attack on the mosque during Ashura and Al-Hassa was resoundingly criticized by the Grand Mufti within 12 hours of that attack. And it was actually the first time in my immersion in Saudi Arabia that you'd seen the Sunni majority community come to the defense of Shia in Saudi Arabia. I don't know if this is the beginning of something new. I have my fingers crossed that it is. But in the absence of dialogue, it'll drift back to the same old challenge. I don't know that it's too late, though. I don't know that it's too late at all.
I think we have time for one more question. I believe we're there.
I think she's a student.
Oh, student, yes, please.
So I know that right now there's like the largest number of young Muslims that the world has ever really had before, and a lot of Arab countries in the Middle East don't have the economies to be employing all of these young people as they're getting older, and that this is one of the biggest problems for radicalization is that there's such a young, a lot of times educated population that has nowhere to go or nothing to do. How can we help combat that threat and help, bring this new generation of young Muslims that a lot of the time is going to not have any place to work more into moderate Islam versus more radicalized Islam?
Well, first off, I personally have never, I'm more nuanced about the argument about economic motivation. I don't think people are drawn to Islamic extremism because of poverty. I don't think that's it. Yes, in a Marxist era, yes, poverty related to things in Latin America, for example. I think the motivation is a deeper, again, cultural and religious motivation to do this idea of defending Islam because of this feel that it's weak or somehow fragile. On the other hand, the point you raise is true in that there was a high birth rate. So Islam is growing as a religion partly because of very high birth rate, and in those regions, it is beginning to come down. By the way, in Saudis, you hear more and more of women who, especially college women, who are postponing marriage, postponing having children. So that's going to have an impact. But I think, again, on a positive note, to me, this is time for you Saudi kids to start majoring in economics, because the issue here is job creation. You need to think deeply about what does make a growing economy and job creation in the private sector. Public sector jobs work fine if you're in Saudi Arabia and you have a lot of money. In those countries that don't have great oil wealth, you can't do that. The private sector should generate jobs. So I think the solution to what you're talking about isn't necessarily foreign aid or some kind of, contribution from the outside. It's really serious and deep thought within the region for economic models that make sense for the region that do job creation.
Okay, and with that, please thank our panel again.